SJR 4 by Bands of the House and Standards of the Senate, a resolution relating to joint resolution.
Members, please take your seats, take your conversations outside. Representative Bands, you're recognized to explain your resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, SJR 4 is a joint resolution making two separate applications to the United States Congress to call a convention of the states under Article 5 of the United States Constitution for the purpose of proposing amendments. Be happy to answer questions.
Member yields for questions. Representative Kern, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you. Representative, in reading as you read your description of what the bill was about, last year am I not correct in that last year you introduced a bill for one amendment, and this year it's amendments plural. So would you not agree that this resolution just continues to change, and so that does not lend itself to creating trust among the people that this will not become a convention that will do who knows what?
I appreciate the question. We had two resolutions before us last year, and in an attempt to minimize the number of times that we needed to address the resolutions to Congress, we simply put them both in one resolution. Nothing has changed in terms of the substantive language of either of those, but it now just appears in one resolution as opposed to being in two separate vehicles.
Representative Brumbaugh, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, I'm concerned we keep talking about resolutions. I have a resolution here, a joint Senate resolution dated in 2009, members. In 2009, 90 members of this body signed this resolution which rescinded any further applications for a constitutional convention. And 44 of the members are still in this room. And during that time, Representative Bands, you're a good friend, but you signed on to this resolution. Can you explain why you signed on to this, and today, after so many different times this has come up here, that we're continuing to still push this? Thank you.
I appreciate the question. You can't rescind something that hasn't happened yet. So what that bill did was to rescind all outstanding and open resolutions that Oklahoma had. And one that I'm aware of passed 40 years ago in this body with a substantive vote of 89 to 5 or 85 to 9, I believe it was, which called for a convention addressing the challenge of the balanced budget amendment. Now, I was on record. I voted for that resolution. I thought anything that we had that was open-ended in the past needed to be brought forward in current and needed to be acted upon at the time the issues were being contemplated and debated, not only in this state but across the country.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Speaker. But the point of this resolution is that we would rescind any further calls for a constitutional convention. It's pretty clear in the language here. And we had 90 members in this body. The vote was 90 to 6. And then last year we had a vote of 52 members of the body. Wouldn't you agree that it might be a little bit difficult, as Representative Kern was saying, that we feel like that we're going to, since this has been going on for 50 years, that we can go ahead and maybe adopt this? Wouldn't you agree?
No.
Representative Harden, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative in committee.
With technology and whatnot that we have today, that cost would be mitigated to a large extent because they would probably convene and recess and then do a lot of the work in committees and online and back and forth with the technology assets that we have available to us today, which would greatly reduce the cost of a gathering that would be a sitting convention like you would think over an extended period of time.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So we're requesting 2 amendment cycles, I guess you would call it, or but I see no funding formula or anything in this SJR. So how are we going to fund whatever we do?
What you have is 2 resolutions according to the authority of Article 5 of the United States Constitution that are an attempt to reach the threshold of 34 equal sovereigns to call that gathering. And until that happens, there's no way to compute what a cost would be, and the states respectively at that time would have to assess those costs and address them in their respective domains.
One last follow-up, and I'm going to ask you to get back in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So by requesting these amendment conventions and no funding source being identified, are we not putting our own Article 10, Section 23 of our own Constitution into question here by obligating future bodies to pay for something that we don't know what the cost is going to be?
I don't believe that to be the case.
Representative Brumbaugh, you recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, we heard one of the biggest proponents of this type of con say in the media that he didn't care about the risk. Would you be surprised to know that Thursday night at about 7 o'clock, I was here late doing some filing, and I was dropped off on my desk 5,000 petitions from Oklahomans who oppose an Article 5 convention. I have the box here. They're all from all your districts all over the state. In just one setting, we had 5,000 people because they're concerned about the dangerous convention and signed this petition to our state legislature, and they're available. Would you be surprised to hear that?
No, I wouldn't be surprised, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that a survey conducted across the entire state of Oklahoma as recently as a week ago indicated that 84% of over between 3,000 and 3,500, and I don't remember the exact number, polled across the state in each of our districts, were in favor of taking action as a state to join the movement to push back against Congress, who seems to be out of control and out of touch and unresponsive to the needs of the people across the country.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would that poll have been conducted by somebody associated or with the conventions of the states?
It was not conducted by anybody that's associated with the organization called the Convention of States.
Representative Rich, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, in calling for a constitutional convention, would you see any problems with proposing more than one amendment?
Well, first of all, I would once again disagree with your characterization of it being a constitutional convention, and I don't see any reason why people would continue to refer to it that way unless it's intended to confuse and play into a narrative that is just not what the wording of the Constitution is. It's an amendment convention, and the language in the Constitution is plural. It could be one or it could be plural, meaning more than one amendment, as it would relate to the purpose for which that gathering had been called. And the purpose for which it is called is singular in nature. If you're considering the balanced budget amendment agenda, they may very well advance language for more than one amendment, but it would be with regard to that particular subject for which the 34 aggregate resolutions called the convention into being.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So let's call it a convention, amendment convention that you're calling it, and let's propose here that this could open up to delegations like California, that might want to massage or do away with the Second Amendment. What would you think about that?
Well, I appreciate your willingness to at least acknowledge it's an amendment convention. Because they're not my words, they're the words out of the Constitution. Let me answer your question. What you're saying is 34 states would call a convention for a single purpose and then convene and then take up an entirely different agenda simply because, and that just flies in the face of reason. It takes a state by state, one vote per state, to ratify anything that's a work product of that. So California would be equal to Oklahoma or Texas or North Dakota in terms of their representation as it would relate to any vote that would be taken in that gathering.
Representative Kern, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, I appreciate your belief, I guess I'll say, in the possibility that everybody who would go to this convention would go there with the utmost pure motives and have no partisan agenda to put in place. And you keep calling it an amendment convention. Would you believe that as polls have been taken, close to, or not close, over 60% of the American people believe that our Constitution today is outdated, antiquated, it really can't work because society is so different today than it was when the founders wrote it. Would you believe that over 60% think it's outdated?
I'm sure you can find a poll that would reflect what it is that you've advanced. Yes, I don't know that I need to refute that.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
There are numerous polls that show that a lot of the Americans today think that our Constitution is outdated. Is it too far-fetched to think that some of these people who might go to this amendment convention could be some of those who think that there needs to be more needs to be done rather than just a couple of amendments?
I wouldn't advance the idea that I could speak for somebody who's selected to go. This body, in conjunction with the Senate, the legislative body in this state, would be responsible for selecting the folks who would represent Oklahoma, and that would occur in all other 49 states. And they're all going to bring whatever ideas they've got. But the singular purpose for which the gathering has been called is stated in the resolutions that bring it into being. And I have misspoken. Technical language that says convention for proposing amendments. I called it an amendment convention, but the actual language in the article itself shall call a convention for proposing amendments, and that's really the proper way to describe what happens.
You're recognized for one last follow-up.
So is it your contention that the main reason for doing this is because of the budget deficit and the runaway spending that we have in our nation now?
Well, I will tell you that 40 years ago, when this body acted on a resolution addressing a balanced budget amendment. They were concerned about billions of dollars in debt. Not long ago, we've just gone over 19 trillion. That is a core purpose of one of the segments of this resolution, is the balanced budget. That's the single issue. There is a limited issue in the other section of the resolution, which addresses not only the fiscal restraints, but term limits and scope and jurisdiction of the federal government.
Representative Wesselhoff, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, you and I have spoken several times on this issue, and one of my reservations, as you well know, is I had reservations about governors selecting delegates, moderate governors, even moderate governors of my own party and of my state, I might add. So you are telling me that the delegates are chosen by the House and the Senate. That's correct, right?
That is correct.
Follow up?
The legislatures.
The legislature.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Nebraska has a unicameral system.
Does that bill or resolution, that instrument, must that be signed by the governor before it can go into effect?
No. This resolution, we pass it in the House, it passes in the Senate, it goes to Congress with the instructions to aggregate each of those two sections independent of one another, so that the balanced budget section aggregates with the other 28 states that have already passed resolutions calling for a balanced budget amendment. The other segment of the resolution aggregates with the 6 other states that have already passed that resolution, and it bypasses the governor for signature.
One last follow-up.
But it's true that the legislature could choose, not only this legislature, but the other 49 could choose to have the governor involved in making those selections if they chose to do that, correct?
I would not attempt to speak for the other states and how they choose to administer this opportunity to join this movement.
Representative Canada, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, help me with one little part of Article 5, where it refers to mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. Would you help me understand that?
There are 2 ways to propose amendments. Language. Congress can propose the language, or on applications of the states, when 2/3 agree. That's the 2 methods that the proposed language would be put out there. The ratification threshold, Congress gets to choose, and they have 2 choices. They can send it to the states to be dealt with in the legislatures, or they can send it to the states with the instructions that conventions in the states be called for that purpose. That is one of the few functions that Congress has in this process.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for that answer, because does that not raise some question now, no matter how the convention or the group is put together, eventually Congress will make that decision on how it is ratified. And so what we're actually voting on is sanctioning Congress's authority to ratify in some form or another.
All we're doing is joining the required number threshold of 34 that needs to be reached to trigger the process of proposing the language. And once that language is agreed to by that gathering, it goes to Congress, and at that point, then they choose one of the 2 methods whereby they want it dealt with for ratification.
One last follow-up, then I'm going to ask you to get back in the queue.
Thank you for your generosity, because I wasn't, you just answered, your answer caused me then to ask you to speculate as to which of those choices that Congress would make relative to which party controlled Congress. I realize this is kind of a government class question, but I know you've been there and you'll articulate it so that we all understand.
Congress has that choice, and I don't deny that political considerations would be a part of that decision. I can only tell you that the 27 times that we have added amendments to our United States Constitution, 26 of them have been sent to the state legislatures for ratification. The 21st Amendment, the repeal of the 18th, went to conventions in the states.
Representative Echols, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, you've been asked a lot about the possibilities of doing something. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about the possibilities of doing nothing. Are you aware that the average per individual in the United States, their portion of the national debt is almost $60,000?
Yes.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Representative. And are you aware that since, and Madam Speaker, am I only in one question and one follow-up?
Not yet, but we're approaching that threshold.
And are you aware that since September 30th, 2012, the average increase in the national debt is $2.43 billion per day?
No, I wasn't aware of that. But I am aware that we are on a track that is unsustainable.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
My final question, you know, I've got to meet your children, and I think you got to meet mine at an event. If we keep down the path that we're going down, do you have fears whether or not we are going to have any economic stability as a nation to give to our children?
That uncertainty is where we're headed.
Representative Pruitt, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Vance, you referred a little earlier to a recent survey in the state that asked the question if they would be in favor of this process. Did I understand you correctly? Over 80% of the people agreed with what you're trying to do here.
Let me see if I can pull the exact number. March the 19th, this was a survey of 2,413. There's 87.9 answered yes to the question for a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. The one I just quoted, it dropped about 3% a week or so ago. A different group of folks I surveyed, and a little larger universe, it was over 3,000, it was 84%.
Representative Brumbaugh, you recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The ultimate safety net for that is that whatever they were to roll out is going to have to appeal to not the 34 that were together, the coalition that called the convention, but they've got to find 4 more states that will agree that it's a good idea before it becomes a part of the Constitution.
One last follow-up. I'm going to ask you to get back in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. But isn't that exactly the point? Is, as Justice Goldberg said, there is no workable, viable mechanism to stop dismantling our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I would not agree. The authority for this convention to be convened is in our Constitution. I hear all the time people say, we don't need to change the Constitution, we just need to live up to it. I couldn't agree more. Article 5 of the United States Constitution gives you and me equal standing to do one thing, and one thing alone, and that is to come together to propose language that then is submitted to the people in either conventions or in legislatures to determine whether or not it's a good idea, the ultimate safety net.
Representative Nelson, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, one of the chief concerns I had was not that you would have a bad amendment adopted by a bunch of states. I'm not convinced even remotely that that would happen, but that you could have an amendment that's bad that would sit out there with the potential of being adopted for the next 100 years, which happened with one of the original 12 amendments to the Constitution that was proposed. I've been told that there is case law from the U.S. Supreme Court that provides a shelf life for any amendments that would be proposed or adopted. Can you speak to that? Is there a shelf life, and is there a good foundation for assuming that there is a shelf life, that if there's a bad amendment that it would basically cease to be viable at some point?
Yes, there is. And what you have cited is the example of the 12 articles that were submitted with the Bill of Rights. Articles 3 through 12 were adopted. We call them the Bill of Rights, the first 10. The other one hung out there until about 1992, and it was the Congressional Pay Raise deal, which became the 27th Amendment. More recent attempts to amend the Constitution, when Congress has sent, and the ERA is the one that I would lift as an example, in the early 70s, I think it was 73 when that went out, it went out with a 7-year statute of limitations, if you will, or a 7-year period under which it was to be acted upon in the state legislatures. It was obvious it wasn't going to reach the 38 state needed to make it become part of the Constitution. Congress tried to go back and extend that for an additional 3 years, and that was litigated. And it was found, and that 3-year period ended up coming and going before the final litigation on that, I think, played out. But there is precedent for the Congress, when amendments go out now, to set a certain time period with it, and then whatever that would happen to be, when that time's up, they can't be. There is legal precedent that they can't modify that to adjust it so that it hangs indefinitely out there until the number could be reached that would be desired for the ratification.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to make sure I understand. So who set the original time frame of 7 years? Was it Congress? Was it the states? Was it the convention? Who set that?
Congress sent that out with the ratification instructions.
I'm going to follow up.
You want him to answer that question? Did you answer the question?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, this is your last follow-up, and then we're going to ask you to get back in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So in that case, Congress set it, so Congress could make some change or choose not to set a time frame of viability for an amendment. Can the states do that? Is there some reason to believe a state or this group of states could set some time frame for which an amendment would be viable?
I think that's outside the purview of what the states would be doing with regard to their convention. Their purpose for gathering is simply to draft the language for the amendment, and it's the role of Congress to set the time and the place for that the ratification threshold to be administered.
Members, we're to the point in the queue where now I'm going to allow one question and one follow-up. Representative Moore, you're recognized for one question and one follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So there are some fail-safes against states that might introduce some crazy amendments, and one is ratification. Those bills that are presented that are passed at a convention of the states that then have to go through a ratification process whereby even more states have to ratify them before they become part of the Constitution. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So is there any other fail-safe for we the people that want to have a voice and want to take some kind of action against a runaway Congress?
There are other options. I suppose the textbook idealism in me would say if we just elected the right combination of people to Congress to begin with, they wouldn't spend more money than they're taking in. So that I suppose is a hypothetical. The first safeguard is in the convention itself. It takes a simple majority, 26 states, to agree for a course of action to be pursued.
Representative Rich, you're recognized for a question and one follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm looking at Article 5 now of the Constitution, and it's silent about concerning any rules of the convention. And actually, I don't even see a blueprint on how to choose delegates in Article 5 in the U.S. Constitution. We have to have rules, and I'm looking in the Oklahoma Constitution. There's nothing about how the state could have any rules and how the votes could be counted or how to require delegates to follow instructions from the state legislature. So could you convince me that there is a blueprint and there's rules for this convention according to the Constitution?
The Constitution is silent, but what is very readily available is the precedent that we have to look at from a historic perspective. When the group gathered in Philadelphia, May to September of 1787, each of those 12 states not only selected legislatures, selected their delegation, they sent with them a set of commissions, instructions under which they were to operate in that gathering. So that's going to be up to this body and the body across the rotunda in the event we're going to have the occasion to select delegates to attend one of those gatherings.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Nobody, including the courts, has clear authority over this convention. Wouldn't you agree?
This is a gathering of equal sovereigns. There are 50 of us in this union. And it's that group of delegates who will gather under the authority and the auspices of the instructions they've been given and the authority they've been given to attend that will adopt the rules that will pertain to their operations, much like what we do at the beginning of each 2-year cycle. We adopt our own set of rules, and then we live under those rules for the next 2 sessions. That's essentially what would happen with that gathering.
Representative Kern, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Vance, are you listening?
I am.
Okay.
I'm all ears.
You and I have both taught government, and we know the circumstances under which the first Constitutional Convention met. They boarded up the doors and the windows and everything because they didn't want the people at the time to hear what the things they were deliberating on and everything to cause any division before anything was settled upon. How do you foresee, if this convention comes about, how do you foresee the climate, I guess you could say, of such a convention being held? Would it be in secret like the first one was? Will it be a media frenzy like we see today so often because of the mainstream media, et cetera? How do you envision this, please?
Thank you for the question. It's a great observation. We are living in different times than that original gathering. I think it's entirely conceivable that what we would witness on a national scale is what you and I are part of today. Our images are carried out across the internet, and people who care to pay attention and know what's going on are going to be a part of that. I can't think of a greater lesson in civics for our nation than to immerse ourselves in a conversation of this magnitude over something that's this important for future generations. And it would not be secret. It would be a national conversation. and that in itself would help draw things, I think, would help draw things to a point where we could, where we would have presented for the people in their discussions restraints that would be appropriate for balancing the budget or other actions that they might take if a convention were called for a more limited scope and jurisdiction. Whatever those amendments would be, I don't see any downside to the nation having that conversation.
Okay, hold on. You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I agree. I think that the media would be all over it. I think it would be a media frenzy. I think also you would have political pressure from different groups and organizations who would be, or would you not agree that there would be political pressure from different groups who might have not so pure motives as you are assuming all of these individuals will have, who will be there trying to influence these delegates to do certain things, and therefore the outcome we cannot definitively say, as you are trying to give us the impression that it will go XYZ, just like this. Would you agree that that is a huge possibility that could exist?
First of all, I appreciate you agreeing with my former statement. And I do agree that there would be all kinds of input coming from all kinds of directions and vested interest groups, not a whole lot unlike what each of the people that we send to be our voice in Washington, D.C. right now experience in the congressional setting. But to take the next step and say that you or me or anyone else who is asked to serve in that role would do anything other than to represent the voices that sent us there, I think is a step too far.
Representative Proctor, you recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Bands, I've asked you this question in our personal conversations off the floor, so I'm not blindsiding you with it. But my question is more of along the lines of how we're going to pursue and proceed the rest of this session. And so my question is, how would a member of this House justify voting yes on this bill, and in a few weeks we're voting yes on $500 million of bonded indebtedness to fund the state budget?
Thank you for the question, and we have had that conversation, and you know that there's a world of difference between voting bonds, which have dedicated revenue streams for the retirement of those bonds and a systematic way to pay that back. There's a world of difference between that and an open-ended capacity to borrow without ever any intention of paying it back. And that is an enumerated power in our Constitution, and that is what has got us into trouble where we are today.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So Representative Bands, for your members that have primaries, how many mailers do you think it'll take to explain that?
Four? I don't know.
Representative LePack, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just trying to think about the number of mailers here. Representative, it seems to me that the major argument, the thought behind much of the questioning here is around fear and mistrust and reasons why not to convene a convention of the states for the purpose of proposing amendments. Would you mind spending a second here talking about the reasons why we should be thinking about that?
When you, a big part of my closing statement will address the why, but there are 19 trillion reasons why on the balanced budget side of the equation to begin with, and who knows where that's leading. There's an unresponsive federal government, an out of control or a balance that is not appropriate between the federal and the state governments as it was initially set up in our Constitution as a federal system where you have an appropriate homeostasis, if you will, there. That has gotten out of control to where, and we, because we have abdicated our responsibility as states and state legislatures, we have allowed that gradual erosion to occur. That's another reason we need to step forward and say, okay, let's rethink this and let's pull back and let's hold them a little more accountable.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, have the states ever been able to reclaim some of the authority granted to them in the original Constitution, to your knowledge?
I think the reverse really has been true for the most part, is we incrementally have allowed it to move from a proper balance of a strong central government and equally strong regional governments called states to a point where we have become dependent upon them at our own peril.
Representative Wesselhoff, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, you seem a little reluctant. If they preemptively pass a balanced budget amendment, I'd love for them to do that. But if they do that, what happens to your Article 5 convention? Or Article 5 convention? Are you only going to assemble for term limits? What happens in that scenario?
Each of those issues would have to stand on their own merit in terms of moving forward with the amendment convention process under the authority of Article 5. What you have just described is precisely what happened with the 17th Amendment. They got close in terms of the number of states, and Congress, rather than let the states convene and write the language, they wrote the language and submitted it to the states. Now, to the credit or discredit of the states, it got approved in 38 states, so it became the 17th Amendment. But I could only hope that we could at least get close enough to maybe get them off of the dime and they would act. You see, Congress, every day they convene, is a convention that has the capacity to send us language for a balanced budget amendment. My question to you is, how long can we afford to wait on them to do that?
Representative Stone, for what purpose?
I'd like to suggest the absence of a quorum.
Oh, no, we've got a quorum.
I counted. I did.
There's 51 here.
It's been suggested the absence of a quorum. Clerk will activate the machine for a quorum call. Members, if you're in your offices or in the hallways, please come to the chamber for a quorum call. If you're in the chamber now, please activate your buttons for a quorum call. Chair sees a quorum. Representative Wesselhoff, you're recognized for a follow-up.
Representative Wesselhoff.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representing Bance for my second question. In these legislatures that choose delegates, how are minority parties protected in that process, in that some legislatures, the minority party, they may only have a dozen members. We have a minority party here that's a lot more than a dozen. But what happens in the states that are overwhelmingly predominantly of one party? How is the minority protected in having equality going to this article convention?
I would simply answer that by saying each state is going to select based on their vested interest and the way they evaluate their opportunity to send their voice to that gathering. Minority, majority. Hawaii, I think, has maybe one Republican senator in their Senate, you know. Chances of a Republican being in that delegation are very slim. But it is what it is with regard to the states, and whatever the composition of the legislature happens to be when they're given that opportunity.
Representative Kennedy, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bans, you mentioned earlier that there were 19 trillion reasons to do this. I just checked the debt clock. It's actually at 19,248 billion. So it continues to grow. I can't imagine there's anybody in this room that's happy about that fact. This piece of legislation, this resolution, allows for us to utilize our Constitution, which is what it's meant to do. What other option do we really have here?
Well, as I've already explained, Congress any day can initiate the process. We have that equal opportunity. Other than that, you have the ballot box every 2 years in November. But that's the only way you're going to be able to that's the only way you're going to be able to address an enumerated right, an enumerated power in the Constitution, is through the amending process, and it can only happen two ways.
Representative Lockhart, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, I don't know if you can remember all the way back to our conversation last year when we had this resolution. I asked you about the economic theories that our nation has operated under since the Great Depression. Does those economic theories, are we following Keynesian economic theory, or have we not followed sound economic theory through the last 100 years and got ourselves into this mess?
This is not this resolution doesn't deal with that particular question, and I don't know. I'm not sure I understand the question that you're asking.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I'm getting at is you're proposing a balanced budget resolution. Keynesian economic theory says that in good economic times we should run budget surpluses or at least a balanced budget. In bad economic times, that's when we spend out of our savings account, kind of like what we're doing this year. The problem, wouldn't you agree, is that in good economic times we have not balanced our budget at the federal government level. My point is, wouldn't you agree that it's not the Constitution's fault, it's the fault of the politicians we elect and send to D.C.?
Are you asking, do I agree with that, or? No. I don't know what, we didn't get into this mess overnight, and we're not going to get it out of it overnight. So I think I'm not sure where your reference point there is. In the last 3 decades, possibly 4 decades, I think we've only had 1 year where we brought in more than we spent. So that has transcended both parties' leaderships and both parties' control of Congress. So that's a conversation for an economics class. We're just trying to figure out a way that we have an opportunity to at least draft some language that will deal with the enumerated power of borrowing money and put some kind of limit or ceiling on the debt ceiling, or have some kind of restraint on Congress to be able to live within its means.
Representative Brumbaugh, you recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, I appreciate you standing for all these questions. I'm not going to ask you a question on speculation or any of these other things, or how many reasons we have to do this. Wouldn't you agree that the compact clause of our Constitution, which is Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, states that no compact can be entered into without the approval of Congress? And my question to you, Representative Bands, is why would, and this is a circular reasoning question, this isn't speculation, why would the same body who created the problem give away their power of the purse? I'm not getting that. Could you fill me in on that?
Well, we're not dealing with Article 1, Section 10 on the compact deal. There is another approach to the balanced budget amendment that uses the compact language. That's a totally separate movement. It is not a part of this resolution. The Congress is not willingly going to give up their power of the purse. That's what's at stake here. We can't wait on Congress to discipline itself. The states have an opportunity to step forward and send directly to the people the question as to whether or not they want to put that kind of restraint on Congress.
You recognize for a follow-up.
Just one. But that's the point I'm making, Representative Bands, and thank you. That's what legal scholars are saying. This is what would be tied to that, and this is what the Congress would do. It's like letting the fox into the hen house. They're just not going to do that. They haven't done it up to this point, and we've had 229 years of this. Wouldn't you agree this is just a large mountain to climb that we're just not going to get to?
I would agree. It's a large mountain to climb. We've had 229 years of waiting on them to act. We can't wait 230.
Representative Rich, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, it was mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if it was you that mentioned that a convention could change the rules of for ratification of the amendments, and the delegates might be pressured by outside interests. The delegates could vote to send amendments to the vote of the people per popular vote. So doesn't that concern you, that since there are the rules of ratification and outside interests like George Soros and others, the media could pour a lot of influence on these delegates? Wouldn't that concern you?
No, it wouldn't concern me. If there's a convention called, if the Congress is going to send to the respective state legislatures the question of whether or not we're going to ratify, I have confidence that you won't take George Soros's money for your vote. You'll vote the people that you represent.
Recognized for follow-up.
Would you agree that, thank you, would you agree that there's no way, that a quote was made by former Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger, there's no way to effectively limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. After the convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. Would you agree that's his quote?
I would agree that's his quote and that's his opinion, but you can find as many or more legal scholars, if you want to put them in that category, who would disagree with that.
Representative Nelson, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, can you speak briefly to the legal authority that the delegates will have? I mean, you can't just say, I'm a delegate, drive to wherever this meeting is going to be held, show up and start voting your personal preference or will. You've got to be selected by the state, and I'm not interested in the process of selection, but you're selected by the state through a process you described earlier. But what hasn't been addressed, I don't think, is the legal authority that they have. Does the state define the legal authority? Can they just make it up when they get there? Or are they representing themselves when they go there? Because that's what part of the fear that I hear is that they're going to just go up and kind of do whatever they want to do, which would be to represent themselves and not act within the scope of the legal authority granted them by the state. That they would have a pretty close tether to the will of the people of Oklahoma. Can you talk about the legal authority issue?
That is precisely what would happen. The delegates would be selected, or in this case, if you use the historic term, it's commissioners. And the states then would issue that group of commissioners their commissions, their marching orders, their instructions. And every state instructions is going to be a little bit different. I thought I had with me a copy of the 12 that met in Philadelphia, and they're all eerily alike in terms of what they were sent there to do. But that's precisely what would happen with regard to the selection process here and then issuing that. The reason we haven't addressed that, there's no point in getting the cart before the horse. The resolution needs to be passed. We need to be in the game, and then when it comes time to select those delegates, or prior to the time you select delegates, this chamber and the one across the rotunda will get together and decide what those instructions will be for our delegation.
Representative Harden, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, on page 4, line 3, talks about in the absence of a national emergency. Who determines a national emergency?
When the delegations gather and those folks are hammering out the language, there's going to be a number of things that are going to have to be addressed. A national emergency is one of them. And that group, or if it doesn't, it probably doesn't have a chance for ratification. I don't know what that would look like. There's no way to predict at this point. That would be a product of the national conversation that we would have. What about the declaration of war? What about, well, that's easy. We can balance the budget. We just raise taxes until we get all we need. There would have to be those kinds of restraints that are going to be implemented in the language that are going to, that not only will appeal to the 34 states that call the gathering, but appeal to 4 more for the purpose of ratification.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, since 9/11, it seems like we've been in a national state of emergency all along. In fact, reading an article here, the current president has renewed President Bush's declaration 6 times of a national emergency. So we're in a perpetual national emergency state. So this would do what for us as a nation?
Well, again, the language that's going to be submitted to the people for approval is going to spell out what those parameters are going to be that may very well place limits on what you've just described. It may very well leave it to where it's with action of the Congress, or it could be referred to the state legislatures or for approval before a debt ceiling could be lifted, or again, the declaration of war is what you're referring to there. We've been at war, but we've been under it without Congress actually declaring it. So you have identified a portion of what that amendment language would have to include and would have to address, and they will.
Representative Kern, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This will be my last question. Okay. Seven. Representative, you, a while ago in answering Dr. Ritt's question, you said to him, you can find just as many scholars to say one thing on this side and just as many on the other side to say something else. So that right there ought to say to us that if the convention is called, we don't really know what's going to happen, because you could find as many people on this side to want this and as many people on this side to want that. Would you not agree that that is certainly a possibility?
Let me ask you a question. Have you ever served on a task force in this body? Okay. When you were named to the task force, did you know in advance what it was going to be like or the kind of outcomes that were going to be?
Wait a minute. You're recognized. Your microphone was not on.
I know. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, and in one of my task force, it was hijacked. Something happened that I had knew nothing about, so it happens. So may I ask my follow-up?
One follow-up, and I'll ask you to get back in the queue.
No, I won't get back in. I'm done. You said a while ago, and I don't remember exactly, you know, I can't quote you verbatim, unfortunately, but when I was asking you about the possibility of pressure upon these delegates and everything, and succumbing to that, and you said something like, no, you didn't think that would happen. They would go there to represent the people who sent them. And my question to you, is that not what we do already with Congress? We vote for them to go up there to represent us, and are they doing it? The obvious answer is no, they aren't. They're very, and I did write this down, unresponsive federal government. How can we know for sure that this convention will not end up being an unresponsive convention? They'll get there and they have the opportunity to make their own rules and do what they want.
Is that a statement, or do I agree? Okay. No.
Is that your answer? Representative Lockhart, you're recognized for a question on the resolution. He waives. Representative Walker, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Bands, do you find that the federal government self-limit itself very often?
It's not inclined to do so, no.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With that in mind, if we follow the proponents of doing nothing, what do you foresee for your children and your grandchildren?
More of what we've got. We have to take advantage of the constitutional option that we have at our disposal, and we have to try.
Representative Rich, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, I have another quote to see what you would agree with. Would you agree that another former Supreme Court Justice, Arthur Goldberg, said there's no enforceable mechanism to prevent a constitutional convention from reporting out wholesale changes to our Constitution and the Bill of Rights?
I've not seen that quote. If you've got it, I can't disagree with that, no.
You're recognized for a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would you agree that our founding fathers, George Washington included, stated, George Washington, quote, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair."
What I'm concerned with is, wouldn't you agree that you had mentioned all these pure motives and checks and balances on this convention, but yet at the same time when you talk about the Articles of Confederation, which was the original purpose before we had this Constitutional Convention and the ratification of these articles, it totally changed around. How can you guarantee before this body of people who have to vote on this bill that this will not occur? If our founding fathers couldn't do it, what makes us think that our society today can do it?
I'll address part of what you have raised in the form of a question in my closing argument. In a very short period of time after independence, the nation was literally falling apart under the Articles. And those 13 equal sovereigns were scrambling to try to save the Union. And they were acting outside the framework of what they had loosely held together in the Articles to come up with this gathering in Philadelphia. And they deliberated over those months, and they came up with what we know as the Constitution. But it was simply a document of suggestions until it was acted upon in the respective states and adopted the way they proposed it. Ultimately, all 13 of them did. And as they say, the rest is history.
Representative Rich, you're recognized for a question on the resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It was mentioned earlier by one of the representatives that I think he misquoted that Anton Scalia was a Supreme Court justice at the time. When he made that quote, he was actually a law professor at the University of Chicago, but he followed up in a quote that basically stated that he wanted a limited constitutional convention. And then he said, if we had even a thought of it as a Supreme Court justice, he made a statement that he actually quoted, "Woe," with explanation, who knows what would come out of it. Are you aware of that complete quote that Anton Scalia made?
I am aware of that, and I've read the transcript of that entire gathering, and there can be no other conclusion other than the fact that he acknowledged there would be some risk, but the risk was worth taking.
Recognized for follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, it's been mentioned, Representative, earlier by an organization, ALEC, that they originally called it a Constitutional Convention, and then it was shifted over to Convention of States, and modern language. We've heard quotes by you on this floor and in print that we want to stop a runaway spending and deficit spending and stop out of control spending to rein in debt and revive our economy. But this out-of-control government, wouldn't you agree, 80% of the spending right now, and I don't want to get in the ballot booth with you, but I would say you've probably voted for a lot of members of Congress that 80% of this spending is out of budget. It's out of the Constitution already. Wouldn't you agree?
You covered a lot of ground there. I'm not sure I would agree with all of what you just said.
Representative Bands now moves that SJR 4 be advanced from general order. Without objection, that'll be the order. Third reading of the resolution.
SJR 4 by Bands of the House and Standards of the Senate, a resolution relating to joint resolution.
Representative Bands now moves final passage of the resolution. Will there be debate? There will be debate. Members wishing to debate for the measure, press your red button. Your green button. Members wishing to debate against the measure, press your red button. Clerk will open the queue. The queue is preparing to close. Clerk will close the queue. Any members wishing to yield? House will come to order as we prepare for debate. Members, at this time we have Representative Brumbaugh for 10 minutes debating against the measure, Representative Kern for 10 minutes debating against the measure, and Representative Ritz for 10 minutes debating against the measure. We have Representative Bands debating 7 minutes and 30 seconds for the measure, Representative Eccles 7 minutes and 30 seconds for the measure, Representative LePac 7 minutes and 30 seconds for the measure, and Representative Nelson 7 minutes and 30 seconds for the measure. One more time, anyone wishing to yield their time?
Goldberg to the 70s with Berger, Scalia, Ginsburg, you name it. They've all warned against a constitutional convention, yet we continue to bring it up here. How can you limit this to a single subject matter? This is not the Philadelphia State House, and poor Richard's almanac is not out at the bottom. Folks, every blogger, every cable network, every TV station, and media today is not about reporting the news, it's about entertainment. Just look at our presidential election. Oh, so these people are not going to come? And they're not going to propose amendments? Think about it. Goldberg says there's no mechanism, and Representative Ritz was right. There's no mechanism to prevent the dismantling of the Bill of Rights. Chief Justice Warren Berger, there's no effective way to limit a con. After it's convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if you don't like the agenda. Think about it. First Amendment. You're going to have religious liberty groups on one side, and on the other side, you're going to have atheists. Think about the Second Amendment. You're going to have gun control or gun rights people. Michael Bloomberg will be there, and then you'll have Second Amendment folks. You'll have anarchists, and you'll have atheists there, and it'll be out of control. Everybody will want skin in the game. And who controls these things? Come on. We were born at night, but not last night. It's the moneyed groups. The pressure will come from the money groups, and they will influence the governors and anybody who appoints these delegates. You don't believe that? Well, again, I have some more property to sell you. The fact of the matter is, folks, we voted on this. We voted on it last year. We voted on a Senate Joint Resolution number 11 back in 2009, where 90 people in this body, 44 of you are still here, and we said we're going to rescind any further constitutional calls for a convention. You know, Abraham Lincoln said it best. He said, politics can change, but our principles have to remain true. They are inflexible. When are we going to start saying, hey, I voted on that? This is just some version or a new version of the same old thing. The fact of the matter is, this was a bad bill then. It's a bad bill now. And I urge you to not vote on this bill, and let's let it die. And I yield the rest of my time to Representative Kern.
Representative Kern has the maximum time. Representative Eccles, at this time you're recognized debating for the measure for 7 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I have no intention of taking the full 7.5 minutes. I think this is a bill that most people have already decided where they're going to stand and where they're going to vote. But to the extent there are any undecided members on this bill, I've always said in talking with members, there are valid arguments on both sides. This is a bill and this is an issue that invokes a great deal of emotion, and I'm glad that it does. If it didn't, we would not all be taking our jobs seriously. I was talking to somebody, and he was, I'm glad we got past some of the arguments. I've said this often. When somebody says to me that an Article 5 convention would take away our Second Amendment, I immediately challenge them with, name me 20 states that would get rid of the Second Amendment, much less 37. That's not a real argument. Frankly, if there's any real argument, the real argument is, are we too far gone? Are we so far gone? Are we so dependent upon overspending that we just don't care anymore as a nation? That we are okay that our next generation is picking up the bill for our excesses, because that's what we have going on. I don't know what kind of America my grandchildren are going to grow up in, but I know unless we make changes, unless we do something about it, it won't be the same one I did. It'll be an America crippled in ever-increasing debt, run by an aristocracy, run by a Congress that chose 70 years ago to cap their own size in the House of Representatives. We haven't even talked about that. Whether or not we have enough representation, which is why we need term limits on the federal level, because we've made these districts so large, it's almost impossible for a regular person to run for and win Congress. You know, what I can't do, I see the issues, and some of the issues are legitimate. Some of the issues, the Second Amendment, I mean, there's no way. That's not legitimate. Some of them make sense. There are risks. I got a text from a friend, and we were talking about it, and what I had to decide and where I come down is the greatest risk is the risk of doing nothing, because I know what that's going to get us. Doing nothing is going to get us $2 billion a day worth of debt that we've had since 2012. Doing nothing is going to get us $60, $70, $100,000 per person, per United States citizen in debt, because that's what doing nothing is getting us. Doing nothing is going to continue us on the road that we're on, which is not working. See, our framers at some point in time thought this time may come. There may be a time where the federal government has gotten too large and the states need to stand up. And they gave us Article 5. You know, when I took an oath to defend the Constitution, I didn't get to choose which parts I decided to defend. I'm proud to stand, I'm proud to vote in favor of this constitutional remedy that our framers gave us. And what I cannot abide and will not abide is doing nothing. One of the definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Representative from Midwest City, I'm proud to stand with you and try this. And what I'm also proud is I want to be clear, the people that vote no are not my enemies, they're my friends. And I'm proud to stand with them if they have another idea that they want to try. But I serve up here at great personal sacrifice. I leave time with my wife and kids, just like all of you do with your families. And I simply will not come up here and deal nothing. That I cannot abide and will not do. I yield the remainder of my time to the representative from Midwest City.
Representative Bands has a maximum amount of time. Representative Kern, you're recognized for 10 minutes debating against the measure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, many of you know this, or all of you know, this is my last session. A lot of people are thrilled for that. For various reasons. I imagine some of you are thrilled because you won't have to look at my grandson's pictures anymore. So don't think that I don't care about what my grandsons are going to have to face. I do care. I care very much. But I care about something even more than them having a good economic future. I care about them having a future that has liberty in it. And that's what I think is the difference here. I want to bring out first this fact. Our Constitution is not broken, it's not antiquated, it's not outdated. It's the longest surviving Constitution in the world. It's provided the framework for the greatest nation in the world. It's provided the most liberty for its citizens above any other Constitution. The Constitution is not the He is the best friend to American liberty, who is most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself to the greatest firmness to bear down or to oppose profanity and immorality of every kind. Robert Charles Winthrop, a U.S. congressman and one of the first speakers of the U.S. House of Representatives, said, "All societies of men must be governed in some way or other. The less they have of stringent self-government, the more they must have of individual self-government. The less they rely on public law or physical force, the more they must rely on private moral restraint. Man, in a word, will be governed either by the strong arm of God or by the bayonet." Then we have James Madison. James Madison wrote a letter. I'm surprised this hasn't been mentioned. He wrote a letter after they had the first Constitutional Convention. I would like to read it. He said, "If a general convention were to take place for the avowed and sole purpose of revising the Constitution, it would naturally consider itself as having a greater latitude than the Congress appointed to administer and support as well as to amend the system. It would consequently give greater agitation to the public mind. An election into it would be courted by the most violent partisans on both sides. It would probably consist of the most heterogeneous characters, would be the very focus of that flame which has already too much heated men of all parties, would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views who, under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts but inadmissible in other parts of the Union, might have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric." He went on to write, "Under all these circumstances, it seems scarcely to be presumable that the deliberations of the body could be conducted in harmony or terminate in the general good. Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second, meeting in the present temper of America, and under all the disadvantages I have mentioned." Ladies and gentlemen, we have changed astronomically from when he wrote this letter to where we are today. We are a nation divided in every way, economically, on religion, on values, education. We are divided, and we think that people are going to come together and come up with amendments that are going to cause our elected officials to do what they aren't doing already. I don't think so. The partisan divide today is huge. It's huge. How can you get a George Soros in a room along with a Mike Ferris in a room and have a compromise? I just don't see that happening. Do I believe that we have people today, the George Washington, James Madison, Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin types? Yes, I do believe we have those types in our nation today. We have some of them in this legislative body. But I'll tell you something else I believe. Those kinds of people in the political climate we have today would not be the ones elected to go to this Constitutional Convention. And would there be a media frenzy? Yes, you bet there would be. Would there be pressure to do things other than what they were sent there to do? We're naive if we think that would not happen. I've given you my reason of what I think is the problem today. It's not the Constitution. It hasn't changed. Human nature hasn't changed. What has changed is we are a people today who, and I remember Senator Colburn said this once at a town hall meeting. He said, you know, in Congress we do 95%, and that was the number he gave. 95% of everything we do is done behind closed doors. Meaning what? They could get away with anything they felt like they could get away with if they wanted to do it. Men and women today are going to go to this Constitutional Convention and not have some agendas. Yes, they will. They will have their own agendas. Now, is money important? Obviously, money is important. The economy of this country is important, without a doubt. Someone said once, money is not the most important thing in life, but it's way ahead of what's ever in second place. So I know it's important, okay? But you know what? I would rather have liberty and be broke than to have an economy that's thriving today. Also, Here's another statement. My husband gave me this. If we'll take care of the morality, God will take care of the economy. But we are a nation today that believes in separation of church and state. We have a people, they don't know whether they should go to the men's restroom or the women's restroom, and a populace who doesn't seem to care so often. So money is not the answer. Having this kind of convention is not the answer. Is it too risky? Yes, it's too risky, but not for the reasons that the other people have given. I believe the most important thing we need to be concerned about is our liberty, our freedom. And you know what the difference between freedom and liberty? Freedom is the ability to do whatever you want. Liberty is morals involved with that liberty, so you don't do whatever you want. You will do what is best. I urge you to say no to this, and let's pray and get back on the right track for this nation. Thank you very much.
Representative Nelson, you're recognized for 7 minutes and 30 seconds debating for the measure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just by way of analogy, I'm not going to get all sobby here, but when Grace was sick, one of the things we wanted to avoid was radiation therapy because it gives you a whole bunch of secondary cancers, congestive heart failure, all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's not a pretty thing. And the conversation I had with the radiation oncologist, I think, is appropriate here. And this went on for about 2 weeks, and I just said, we're not doing it, you're not doing it, we're not going to do it. And we were going back with the other oncologist, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, they sat me down and they just said, we understand you're concerned about secondary cancers, congestive heart failure, all these kinds of things can happen to your daughter later on. You can avoid all of those things by not doing radiation therapy because she won't be alive to worry about it. And I feel, frankly, like that's where we are as a country. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the path we are on terminates not as far out as you think. You cannot keep doing what we're doing. Either the states are going to step in and do something, or our creditors will step in and do something. It has been said that our national debt is the greatest national security threat facing us. We would all be brave in the face of a national security threat and want to send troops to do whatever we needed to do to defend our borders. But we have a disease here where the treatment is not without risk. There is a treatment option available to us. It's in the Constitution that we're all so worried about. It is risky to use it. Could something go wrong? Oh, yeah. But the one thing I know without a shadow of a doubt, if we don't do something, if we don't try this treatment option, it won't be too long in the future, and it won't matter anyway. It's been talked about a runaway convention. I just know human nature well enough. I think that's the least of our concerns. I think my chief concern is that we go there and show we have no resolve to do anything at a convention, or whatever you want to call it. I'm sorry if I'm using the wrong term, but as we go there and don't do anything. It was mentioned a while ago that for 50 years, states have been considering doing this. We've been threatening it. Congress doesn't believe we'll ever do anything. Congress hasn't changed their behavior. We're worse off than we were because we've refused to take the course of treatment that our founding fathers gave to us to address a situation just like this. Is this beyond what they could have imagined? Of course it is. But they put this in there for the states, perhaps as a last-ditch effort, as a risky treatment, but maybe the only chance you have to reverse the course the country's on, a march towards insolvency and the loss of the national legacy that we're supposed to hand off to our children. Is there risk? Yes. My fear is that it's going to be a stillborn convention. We've talked about limiting, you can limit the legal authority of the delegates to what you want them to do, what the state has instructed. There's a shelf life on bad amendments. I think Representative Eccles' point. I can't see how it makes it worse. I can only see where it slows it down, if anything. So I'm going to tell my children that I did what the Founding Fathers gave me the opportunity to do. And I'll trust God that it works out. Yield the rest of my time to the chair.
Ribs. At this time, we're going to ask the sergeants to open the doors and take a seat and thank them for their service. Representative Rich, you're recognized for 10 minutes debating against the measure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I stand in front of you all today. Many of you know the story about my daughter who came to us December, was in law school, 35 years old. She said, "Dad, I got a lump." And I said, "Well, how long you had it?" "I don't know. My doctor's been watching it." I said, "Well, why didn't you tell your mom? She's an RN, advanced degrees, your sisters and brother-in-law, doctors. Why didn't you tell me?" "Well, I'm 35 years old, and I think that I can handle it." And it turned out to be breast cancer, and we're handling it as a family with the Lord's help. When we decided on her treatment, the first thing as a physician was do no harm. Let's look at both sides of the argument. I've, in 40 years, seen many women with breast cancer, and a few men, too. I don't take this decision on debating against an Article 5, con, whatever you want to call it, lightly, because it's the right or wrong thing to do. Many people are sincere about it. But I always like to look at both sides of the coin. Let's look at the other side of the coin, of the liberal side of it that's promoting it. We've seen most of the conservative side of it, but there are some liberal aspects. I mentioned earlier in a debate last year, Representative Bands said he'd never heard of him, a Harvard professor by the name of Lawrence Lessing. Lawrence Lessing he's called the father of the Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Since 1970, Lawrence Lessing has preached this along with others in the movement for calling a convention, the Wolf Pack, the George Soros Foundation. Lawrence Lessing, Jeff McLean, Shelby Williams have all promoted on their websites and in their meetings, call for a convention because we know that it will be run away. It cannot be controlled. Lawrence Lessing, as I mentioned last year on this floor, he blaspheming. You can go to his website, You can go to his website and see his blasphemy of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He laughs about it in his class at Harvard in front of a symposium, and he thought that was just really something neat to present. And at his Bilderberg conferences, his Wolf Pack meetings, Lessing's continued to promote a constitutional convention for fundamental reform with such people as other professors of law. One of them in particular was a professor of law at Mary Penrose, Texas Wesleyan law professor, currently teaches at Texas A&M School of Law, University of School of Law. She presented a symposium, and Penrose said, "Gun violence requires drastic measures, and affirmed that there is no single amendment that is absolute. No constitutional right is sacred." And she said, "It's time today in our drastic measures to repeal and replace the Second Amendment. And halfway through her talk, she said, by the way, I'm in favor of redrafting the whole Constitution. Before leaving the podium, Professor Penrose said, my solution goes through the Article 5 process. That's the state's model. So we've got Lessing, we've got Penrose, we've got some of the more progressives that are pushing to take away the foundation that's given us, as mentioned earlier, 230 years of freedom. I have two eighth great-grandfathers that were documented and served and fought in the American Revolution, my mother's side. They were Baptists, and my dad always said that's why that the Baptists are so tough, because they were in the Revolution. But honestly saying, we do have a lot at stake here. Law professor. It's been mentioned earlier that the Constitutional Convention, the con, there's a couple of words that just drives me crazy when someone says, trust me, or I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you. It's 10 words that really send a concern and red flag. As a military officer in the United States Army Medical Corps and carried through it as a physician, I want to see documentation to where this is not going to be a runaway convention. And our founders again, and wise people since then, besides Anton Scalia and others, as we mentioned earlier, Justice Warren Burger, there's no way, as he quoted, there's no way to effectively limit or muzzle the actions of the Constitutional Convention. After the convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like its agenda. Also, former Supreme Court Justice, the representative said he was not familiar with this quote. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg said, there is no enforceable mechanism to prevent a convention from reporting out wholesale changes to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. We had a monument out here that was very similar to the Bill of Rights that was taken down, but the Bill of Rights does protect us from many things. The First Amendment, as I heard in a quote by a presidential candidate the other day, he said, we should do away with the First Amendment, and the press needs to have a collar put on it. Well, if that's not scary, getting rid of the First Amendment. And then again, there were people from California that I recently sat in on a conversation with that wanted to do away with the Second Amendment. There's nothing written into the Constitutional Convention bylaws that would prevent any of those. The courts are not going to protect us. The convention would change the rules for ratification. The delegates might be pressured by outside interests, such as the media. Delegates could vote to send amendments to the people, a popular vote. We mentioned earlier about that the rules are not even written down in Article 5. They're silent. There's no blueprint on how to choose delegates and how each state could have and how votes could be counted, or how require delegates to follow instructions for their legislatures. If we simply trust, as populist state roots that we have, and trust people that are going to potentially take control under a constitutional convention, it's a dangerous precedence now, as we see even further where what George Washington said, we don't have the integrity, or we pray for the integrity that they had back there with the Hamiltons, Madisons, Franklins, and Jays, and so on and so forth. The Oklahoma House can do the sensible thing, reject SJR 4, but those who really do cherish the Constitution and don't want to see it tampered with ought to make it clear that a constitutional convention is not a good idea. It only sounds like one. Thank you for your attention.
Representative Bands, you're recognized for 10 minutes. Closing debate for the measure.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, almost everything that we consider in this chamber only has implications and jurisdiction within the boundaries of our state. Senate Joint Resolution 4 is a resolution that reaches far beyond our state and allows Oklahoma to take its place in a movement that requires consensus among the 50 equal sovereigns of our nation. On a recent return flight from a conference, I was seated next to a man reading a book that caught my eye. It was titled Start with Why, written by Simon Sinek. We briefly discussed the contents, and I made it a priority to purchase the book. The focus of the book centered on the why, what, and how aspects of organizations. What we do and how we do it are important, but they must take a back seat to why we act. So, why are we considering SJR 4 today? To answer that question, we must go to our roots as a nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. With a clear understanding of our collective why, listed in the Declaration of Independence, we established a new nation in spite of overwhelming circumstances against us. What happened during the War for Independence and how the war was waged is important to history, but it is the resolve of the why that made the difference. Organized as a League of Friendship under the Articles of Confederation, it was less than 10 years before our nation was faced with the challenge of keeping the Union together. Weaknesses under the Articles included one vote per state regardless of size, inability to lay and collect taxes or regulate commerce, no executive, no national court system, a supermajority to pass laws, and the tyranny of one, a unanimous requirement to amend that led to unrest, bickering, jealousy, and suspicion among the states. George Washington observed, "We are one nation today and 13 tomorrow. Who will treat with us on such terms?" After failed attempts in 1785 and 1786 to gather all the states at Mount Vernon and Annapolis, an appeal was issued for all the states to consider yet another gathering, quote, at Philadelphia on the second Monday, May next. By mid-February in 1787, 7 states had already named commissioners and given them a directive to attend the gathering in Philadelphia. And I want you to note this, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to the Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render adequate, the Articles adequate, to the exegesis of the government and the preservation of the Union, end quote. What happened at Independence Hall in Philadelphia is important. How the commissioners deliberated during that May to September gathering is important, but it is why they gathered that gave us the document we call the Constitution. Why SJR 4? As the convention in Philadelphia was coming to an end, George Mason realized that there was a critical oversight in the language proposed as a method for amending the document in the future. It provided that all amendments be proposed by Congress and ratified by the states. Mason noted that Congress would never originate an amendment that would curb its own power. There was no check on the power of Congress. George Mason suggested, and the framers unanimously agreed, that states needed a way to propose amendments as well. Consequently, language was added to Article 5 that gave states equal standing with Congress to propose amendment language in a convention called by the states for that purpose. State legislatures have never used the provision, and as a result have allowed the central government to expand its power at the expense of the states. Is it possible they looked forward through the ages and saw a time when the national government would be out of control or unresponsive to the equal standing of the states in a federal system? The framers could not have predicted the challenges we face today, but they did understand the nature of man to abuse power. Even though federalism, checks and balances, and separation of powers are built into our system, the power given to the national jurisdiction is limited to the items found in Article 1, Section 8. However, one of those powers is to borrow money. The only way to limit the enumerated power is through the amending process. There are only two ways to propose amendments: Congress or state legislatures. How long can we afford to wait for Congress to send an amendment to the states for ratification that will limit its power to borrow? The only other option is for the states to initiate the process. SJR 4 is an application resolution that serves notice to Congress and the equal sovereigns of our union that Oklahoma wants to be a part of the conversation about bringing our fiscal house under control and restoring a balance to the relationship between the federal government and the states. To address the $19 trillion national debt and restoring balance, I have options. I can do nothing and hope everything works out. I can help elect people to Congress that will not abuse the borrowing power. Number three, I can refuse to act because I do not have all of the answers to the what and how questions of the amending process. Or number four, I can embrace the constitutional provisions given to us in Article 5. I refuse to act in a way that would leave the impression I favored the status quo. I refuse to act in a way that would lead one to conclude that I was frozen by fear of the unknown. The framers of our Constitution did their part by including state legislators in the amending process. Who's willing to follow their leadership? Ben Franklin was asked by a woman when he left the last meeting in Philadelphia Convention, "What have you given us?" Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Members, today we have the opportunity to ensure the next generation has a safe and secure republic. I invite you to join me by voting for the passage of SJR 4. I yield the balance of my time to the chair.
Members, you've heard the debate. The question before the House is, shall the resolution pass? Clerk will activate the machine. Sergeants will announce roll call in the halls. Roll call's in progress. Members, 30 seconds. Members wishing to vote or change your vote, the chair is preparing to close. 10 seconds. Members, if you're in the chamber, you need to cast a vote. Declare the vote.
57 aye, 33 nay.
Having received a majority vote of those selected and constitutional to the House, I declare the resolution to have passed.